Hello everybody, welcome to chapter 17 of Give Me Liberty. The lecture for this week is going to focus on freedom's boundaries at home and abroad. So this is the end of the 19th century, so leading up to 1900. And we'll be talking about freedom within the United States and then what was happening in other countries that the United States was becoming involved in. So starting out at home, something that epitomizes this decade is the Homestead Incident, or sometimes talked about as the Homestead Massacre. And this happened in 1892, so right at the beginning of this decade that we're talking about. And it sort of sets up this struggle between the workers and big business. And what happened took place at a Carnegie steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. A group of workers were on strike due to a rule that only allowed non-union workers to be employed at that location. This was a popular tactic in order to keep union members out and ideally keep the number of strikes down. And on July 6th in 1892, there were about 300 armed private policemen from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They called them Pinkerton men. And they stormed the location at the factory and actually killed 7 of the strikers. 3 of them were killed during this battle as well. And the governor of Pennsylvania actually sent in 8,000 militiamen to tamp down the ruckus, and the Union was disbanded following this. So the big business won out here, essentially. And this is a story, David and Goliath kind of story, that gets set up throughout this decade and throughout much of American history, as you've already seen and as we continue to see. There's this struggle between those on the top and those who make up the middle and bottom. Some of the general themes we'll be talking about throughout this lecture are the increasing wealth gap during this time. And this was one of the highest times throughout U.S. history, and we're approaching the same levels today, actually. So this is really important for us to learn about so that we can sort of check where we are and check how people got out of these situations. We'll also be talking about the populist movement, a new political movement on the rise during this time frame. And we'll be talking about the legalized racial segregation that we saw with Jim Crow. We'll be also talking about immigration and how that was changing. As well as imperialism. We'll end with imperialism here, which is the seeking out of different territory outside of one's homeland country. And these are still issues that we're dealing with today, and it's best that we all understand the history behind this and why we are how we are with places throughout the world and within our own country. Populism was this phenomenon that took place, and it started with this farmers' revolt in the South and throughout parts of the West. As prices were falling for agricultural goods and there was a growing dependency on wage employment, farmers began to rebel against that. They wanted this continuation of an agrarian, self-sustaining lifestyle, but they weren't able to maintain that with the low prices on their goods. In addition to low prices on their agricultural goods, the process of sharecropping and the poverty cycles that led to continued to keep farmers down and continued to keep them in these cycles of debt that they couldn't pay off. Part of this was that the railroads were charging too much to ship the goods. So the prices were low because if people were going to buy them and the freight was going to be paid, the prices on the actual item needed to be lower. So the railroad was charging too much, even though they had more than enough money at the time. It was very there were very large amounts of money involved with the railroad, and the government was involved in the railroad in addition to big business. The Farmers Alliance was established in the 1870s, and by 1890, the beginning of the decade we're talking about, they had warehouses for crops that were set up where extra agricultural goods could remain until they were sold rather than having to have them shipped immediately. The crops were then used as collateral by the banks, and the government would issue loans to the farmers based on that collateral. So they already knew that those crops existed and that they'd been harvested, so they felt confident that once they were sold, the loans would be paid back. Eventually, the Farmers Alliance transferred into the People's Party, which are the populists. And it was made up largely of what they call the producing classes, so farmers, miners, and industrial workers. Today, we often talk about them as being blue-collar workers. So that was who was making up the Populist Party. Their platform focused on economic inequality and political corruption, and suggesting that those things had to end if they were going to move forward honestly. They also believed that there should be direct election of U.S. senators by the people rather than by the legislature. They said that there should be governmental control over currency in order to ensure fairness. So they believed that direct government control over currency and not just local currencies was the way to go. They also believed that there should be a graduated income tax. What that means is the highest earners pay a higher percentage of their income. So it wouldn't be that everybody pays 40%. It would be that people on the bottom perhaps pay 5% and people at the top pay 50% or something like that. That's what we mean by a graduated income tax, and then different levels throughout. They also believed in the right to form unions, and that shouldn't be hampered at all by big business, and it shouldn't be hampered by the government itself. They also believed in public ownership of the railroads. They thought that would ensure fairness if the government or the people or whoever was elected by the people was in charge of the railroads, and they would be able to set the rates. They would be able to maintain lower rates even if they weren't exactly able to set them. But they felt that they could have more control, and that would then help the farmers who were having to pay high rates to ship their goods. It would be a symbiotic relationship if they were able to tamp down the runaway greed that they saw on the railroads. Part of the group was farmers, as we mentioned, and this included small farmers who were both black and white. It wasn't just a white farmers movement in the South. It was a lot of different people who had the same belief system, these basic set of beliefs. And it even meant that there were some white Southerners, while they lived in states that had racially segregated laws, and they had a complicated history with race, as you know, they could see that there was a common enemy for those who found themselves at the bottom of the financial heap. Women were also attracted to the populist platform because they purported to believe in women's suffrage, so believing that women should have the right to vote should have the right to run for office. The government was intricately involved in labor at this point, and in 1893, depression had actually exacerbated the conflict between capital and labor, so those at the top and those at the bottom. Employers, who were big business at this time for the most part, and the government were also intricately connected. So the government was looking at labor and sometimes protecting the workers, and it was also looking at sometimes protecting big business. The 1894 Pullman strike in Illinois took place in Pullman, and the town had actually been created and named for the Pullman train car, and the employees' lives were completely controlled by the company. They built the housing for them, they had churches for them, they had social things for them, and they controlled their work lives as well. Eventually, people went on strike against a reduction in wages, and this led to a court injunction at the federal level that sent people back to work, with federal marshals then being installed at many stations following the strike. So this was, again, another blow to workers and in favor of big business. Eugene Debs and many others were often jailed for their participation in labor uprisings. We'll talk about Eugene Debs more going forward, and you'll be reading about him. But he's perhaps one of the most famous socialist leaders in U.S. history. The 1896 presidential campaign came down to McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. So William Jennings Bryan went around the country talking to Democrats and populists and listening to farmers' grievances. So he was attempting to keep his ear open. He proposed the unrestricted minting of silver coins and condemned the gold standard. He also said an increase in the amount being circulated would help prices go up for farmers and they'd be able to repay their loans faster. So he thought that if you made more money, they'd be able to pay their loans off faster, and goods would go up in price if people had more money. William McKinley ended up winning the race with 51% of the popular vote, but 61% of the Electoral College vote, versus Bryan's 47% popular vote and 39% Electoral College vote. I will put a link on the assignments page if you're curious about how the Electoral College works and why it was set up. I have a short video that I can show you about that, because you would have heard about that in a U.S. History 1 course, but if you haven't taken that, or if it's been a while, it's good to refresh your memory, especially with presidential elections coming up next year. This 1896 campaign was the first modernized U.S. presidential campaign, meaning there was a lot of money spent on the race, and there was an efficiency in the national organization that hadn't been there before. So it came to be more of a time to spend a lot of money, and it became a flashier event. As you know, lots of money is poured in, an astronomical amount of money really is poured into elections today, and this is the first time where you really start to see the direct connection. While all of this political drama is happening, you also have the legalized segregation that was spreading throughout the South. And following the end of Reconstruction, there was a group that called themselves the Redeemers, and they believed in undoing the progress of Reconstruction in the South. They were mostly made up of merchants, planters, and businessmen, and those were the people who had been most directly affected negatively by Reconstruction. So by having their workforce removed and by having their behavior marked as wrong and their moral belief system marked as wrong, they'd been humiliated following the Civil War and had a vendetta against those who had benefited from the Reconstruction era. Illiteracy actually increased during this time frame in Louisiana. And this was not only in African American schools, but it was also in white public schools. The public schools were extremely underfunded, and the schools for black students were quite a bit worse. And part of the illiteracy issue is that it had been illegal to teach enslaved people how to read and write. So many African American citizens in the South weren't able to read and write based on those previous laws. Another law that came up was that if you were unemployed, you could actually be arrested and jailed, for which you were sentenced and promptly rented out as a convict to businessmen and farmers. This was obviously in favor of the Redeemers. It was hard for many African American men to find jobs during this time frame based on the segregation laws, and they were the ones most often picked up, arrested, and jailed, and then rented out as convicts. So they were still being captured and made to do work for free for the same group of people from whom many of them had been freed during the Civil War. There were many industries that actually used this convict labor, and they included the railroad, mines, and the timber industry, as well as local farmers. But many of the big plantations had gone down during the Reconstruction era. The New South talks about the 1880s as an era of prosperity based on industrial expansion and agricultural diversification. So, following the Civil War, there had been a lot of damage to the actual land itself and to much of the infrastructure. In the decades to come, they wanted to rebuild the South and modernize what they had been doing, and realizing that growing cotton alone wasn't going to cut it anymore. There had been a cotton glut within the system, and the South, the southern United States wasn't really the center of the cotton farming anymore, and people needed to change what they were doing and start to grow different crops if they wanted to make any money. The region as a whole in the South actually really suffered financially, and it was really only those on the top who were making any money. The cities were mostly for shipping hubs, but there were a few that were able to develop some industrial work, like Birmingham, Alabama, had a steel plant. You can see this picture to the right, the first carload of steel made in Birmingham, Alabama in 1897. By the 1930s, FDR actually recognized the severity of poverty in the southern states, not only among African Americans, for whom it was extreme, but also among whites. And for many of them, it was also an extreme situation of poverty without any employment possibilities. Black farmers had been long considered the bottom of the heap, both socially and financially. They had the least amount of money, were more likely to be involved in sharecropping, and they were facing legal discrimination on every level. Land acquisition was extremely hard to come by still at this time, and many of the manufacturing jobs were closed off to non-European workers, so any non-white worker would have a harder time finding a manufacturing job in the South. There were less African American workers in industrial jobs by 1900 than there had been during the Reconstruction era. So a little more than a decade following the Civil War, there had been more African Americans working in industrial jobs than by 1900. So a big step back in this case. There was a small black middle class that had been rising up at this time, with some teachers, some physicians, some businessmen, undertakers, and shopkeepers. But for the most part, they were in those positions because the white workers filling these positions wouldn't service black patrons. So they were mostly instated into these positions in order to serve the Black community. There were more African American women who were working than white women, but this wasn't seen as progress in this case. It was seen as the men weren't able to make enough money to support their family, so the women also needed to find work. There was very little political opportunity for African Americans after the fall of Reconstruction, and this lack of available positions really lasted until the 1990s, so it lasted about 100 years from the point that we're talking about. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women promoted women's rights and racial uplift. They had argued for aid to the poor, lessons in home life, and they argued against gambling and drinking. So it's many of the same issues that middle-class white women were bringing up about their concerns about what their husbands were doing or what they weren't able to do themselves. There were many white people who were concerned that Black men could still vote in some cases and really started to look for ways to hamper the African American vote. They didn't want to participate jointly with African Americans in the government. From 1890 to 1906, every southern state made laws that restricted Black voting. So they were concerned about it, and then they had an easy time passing things through their local legislators. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote, but there were many ways that this amendment was thwarted, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and constitutional knowledge quizzes. You can see in the top right, there's a slip for a poll tax, and many people couldn't afford those, so they weren't able to vote if the poll tax was instituted. And you can see at the right here, there's this literacy test barrier in order to be a full member of the American citizenry. There was a grandfather clause that allowed those who could vote before the Civil War to avoid these taxes and tests. It should be noted, only white men could vote prior to the war, so this really only helped them. This really only helped white men. It wasn't going to help African American men. It wasn't going to help women either. And by 1940, only about 3% of adult Black Southerners were registered to vote. And this is partly due to, or mostly due to, the continued literacy tests, poll taxes, and threats of bodily harm when they did manage to approach the polling locations. We talked about how segregation had been enshrined into law at this point, and some of these laws we'll talk about now. There was an 1883 civil rights case which overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which had outlawed discrimination in public settings. So it freed up people to continue to discriminate based on race in public areas. In 1896, probably one of the most famous segregation laws was Plessy v. Ferguson. It originated in Louisiana and made it to the Supreme Court, where the vote went 7-1 in favor of this separate but equal law. John Marshall Harlan was the only dissenter and said that it was because the law clearly violated the principle of equal liberty. You can see over on the left here that this cartoon represents this separate but equal idea, but you can see in the back there's this colored court area, and and it says this seems separate but definitely not equal. And that's what really ended up happening. Public facilities and schools of all kinds were woefully underfunded and just nowhere near equal. Nobody could ever argue that they were actually equal, other than the fact that they existed. The Chinese people who lived within the United States actually experienced similar levels of segregation in the West, with these separate but equal schools and separate but equal facilities, which were really anything but equal as well. Part of the major fear of this time and continuing into the mid-1900s was lynching. And lynching simply means that someone was murdered by a mob. It does not necessarily mean that they were hung, which is most often what people associate it with. And many times people were hung, but it doesn't mean that alone. They could have also been shot, they could have been beat to death, and it still would have been categorized as a lynching. From 1880 to the mid-1900s, there were around 4,000 people who were killed by mobs, mostly based on racial lines. And many times there were actually audience members who stayed to watch the killings. You can see on the top left, there's a number of lynchings, and this goes from 1889 to 1918. So this isn't even that entire time frame, and of course they existed outside of the time frame we're talking about as well, but you can see hundreds within that time frame, with Georgia as experiencing the most number of lynchings. And in 1899, a man named Sam Hose killed his white employer in self-defense, but was sentenced to die for having killed him. And about 2,000 people came out to see him, Sam Hose, killed. So this audience gathering for these killings sounds quite disturbing to us now. People brought their children to see these. They really believed that people were being executed for a just reason. One of the popular tropes was that black men would be accused of having raped white women. They often didn't use the word rape. They would instead refer to it as an outrage. So if you see that often means rape. And even if they had no contact, had never been alone, even if the woman said that it hadn't happened, if they were accused of it, they were usually executed for that. Ida B. Wells, who's pictured on the bottom left here, was a formerly enslaved person from Mississippi who eventually became a teacher, an editor, and really a top anti-lynching activist. So there were many people working to figure out how to prevent this violence from continuing to take place. Claude McKay in the 1920s wrote a poem about lynching, which I think is, I think it's very moving, and this is why I want to share it with you. And he's one of the more well-known African-American poets of the 1920s. He writes, "His spirit is smoke ascended on to high heaven. His father, by the cruelest way of pain, had bidden him to his bosom once again. The awful sin remained still unforgiven. All night a bright and solitary star, perchance the one that ever guided him, yet gave him up at last to fate's wild whim, hung pitifully over the swinging char. Day dawned, and soon the mixed crowds came to view, the ghastly body swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. And little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced around the dreadful thing in fiendish glee. So you can see he's writing about this gathering around the lynchings, around these dead bodies, and this sort of cavalier nature of women and children even who were coming to see what had been done in this sort of sick fascination. And he mentions their eyes of steely blue, which is to ensure you that these are white women he's talking about, and the little lads as lynchers that were to be, assuming that their sons would then grow up to continue the same sort of behavior. Another thing we should mention is the visual representations that we provide during a history course. In many books, they will publish very violent photos. I don't necessarily want to do that unless you're warned ahead of time. So you'll see the picture that I've included here has a shadow of what has happened, and not necessarily one of the thousands and thousands of images of someone's dead body directly. It's a fine line that we need to walk. I don't want to not include any of these images because I do think it's important to really have a visualization of what happened. It's why in museums, for example, the museum in Auschwitz has an exhibit full of shoes and suitcases, and that's really stark for a lot of people to visualize that. The same thing could be said for any historical event. If you have a visual record of it, it may sink in even deeper for people. And part of what was happening here while these racist laws were being instituted and while the violence against Black people in the South was being ignored is that politics, religion, and memory were all sort of winding in with each other. If you get a chance to read Race and Reunion by David Blight, pictured on the left here, it's a really interesting and well done account of this time frame in which African Americans were essentially thrown under the bus by whites in the North and the South in order to have white reconciliation. And the Civil War was at this point being talked about between whites as if it had nothing to do with slavery, as if that was a side note, essentially. And instead that it was a disagreement between whites about states' rights versus the preservation of the Union. So they'd set aside the issue of slavery completely because it was so contentious that they didn't see any way that they could reconcile the North and the South if they didn't decide to ignore that recent history. The lost cause, which you may have heard talked about before, was a romanticization of the Old South and slavery as well, with the whites in the Old South having been benevolent masters, and the enslaved people were happy to be with them in their situation. So this trope of the happy slave. This was the story that people started to tell, and that's what they started to teach in their history books at that time, because African Americans didn't have a voice in creating any of this historical knowledge or the stories that were to follow and be presented to the nation as a whole. Religion helped in this case because it created a common language for white people, especially in the South, to deify the Confederacy. So they lifted it up and sort of saw the Confederate soldiers as martyrs to a cause for having proven a point. Many of the churches actually split over religious moves towards political branches and still remain split into North and South to this day. Like, there are Southern Baptists that you may have heard of, different than ones in the North. There's a different set of beliefs that go along with this, and they're often political. To back all of this up, there was this nativist thought, which meant that white people within the United States who had been there for long enough, 1 or 2 generations, they believed that their stake in the country was more important than others who had just arrived or would arrive later. And in the 1890s, there were 3.5 million immigrants working in industrial jobs. Many of them were Italians, Austro-Hungarians, and Russians. And this group of immigrants were not yet considered white and were instead their own racial categories, along with the Germans and the Irish. They all had their own separate racial categories and didn't have the same rights legally and socially as, let's say, British white Americans. And in 1894, there was a rise in Immigration Restriction League in Boston, which was campaigning for illiterate immigrants to be restricted from entering the United States. This was vetoed by President Cleveland when it came to him, and this was a continuing focus on trying to control who could and who could not come into the country, and trying to decide what was worthwhile for a person to do, and if they couldn't read, should they be allowed in? They wouldn't be able to vote if they couldn't pass the literacy tests, and they felt that they argued that they would be a burden on society. In the North, the secret ballot was established in part to deny illiterate people the vote because they could no longer ask for help. So if they had to cast their ballot in secrecy, they weren't going to be able to ask anybody for help reading the ballot to them or help writing in who they wanted to vote for. One of the most blatant racial policies from this time frame is the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act took hold, which excluded all citizens of China from entering the United States. It didn't allow any Chinese person to immigrate to the United States after 1882. This was the first time that race had been used as a category for excluding people from the right to come to the United States. It seems obvious, but it's worth mentioning that race had been a factor in excluding people from citizenship and from certain rights within the United States. But this was the first time they were explicitly blocking a racial group from coming in. Chinese people in the United States had to carry paperwork with them saying that they were allowed to be here, or they would face deportation. And there were only about 75,000 Chinese people in the United States by 1930 because of these exclusionary rules, and most of them were in California. In 1885, Tate v. Hurley stated that California must admit children to schools in San Francisco, and that there could be segregated schools for white students and Chinese students. So they were saying that they needed to have access to education, but it was a separate but equal policy in which the Chinese schools were inevitably unequal to the white schools that were provided. And it wasn't until 1947 that this was repealed. You also saw the U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898 that said that Chinese children born in the United States were citizens, but also affirmed racial restrictions for immigration. So it didn't overturn that, but it did say that any new Chinese person born within the United States could be a U.S. citizen. You also have the case of Fang Yu Ting versus the United States in 1893 that said the federal government could force Chinese removal without due process. So they could deport people and send them to China without having to go through many channels, and they wouldn't be penalized. Booker T. Washington is one of the more famous intellectuals from this time frame, and he's most famous for having written several books, including his autobiography, Up from Slavery. He was born to an enslaved mother in 1896, and he explained his experience in this book, Up from Slavery, of having been born into an enslaved existence and then having freedom post-war. And he gave a very famous speech that you will read in your Voices of Freedom book at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition in 1895, which in his speech is commonly referred to as the Atlanta Compromise. And it has vehement supporters and detractors at the same time. What it essentially did was suggest that people should adjust to segregation, that they should help themselves and the people around them rather than seeking out rights at the highest levels. And one of the more famous people to call his number, essentially, and to say that they should not put their heads down and that they should continue to fight for full rights is W.E.B. Du Bois. And you'll read both Booker T. Washington's speech and Du Bois' response to this in your Voices of Freedom, and you'll have to answer questions about them. So we won't dig too deeply into them right now, other than to say this is one of the more famous debates from the time frame, and hopefully you can get some insight into how people were feeling at the time and what they were hoping they would be able to accomplish. In the same vein, we have the women's era, and from the 1890s to 1920 is commonly referred to as the women's era. Women saw increased opportunities and roles in public life, and by 1920 this culminated in the right to vote for women at the federal level. So next year it'll be 100 years that women have been able to vote on the federal level in the United States. Job opportunities were growing for some women, but not mostly for married women or for mothers. They were expected to stay home once they had gotten married or once they had children. And in addition to those classifications, many Black women found it hard to find work that paid a decent wage, and they were typically excluded entirely from many of the opening spaces for women, like working in education or in clerking. They were segregated out of these jobs. Women were heavily involved in the organization and leadership of reform movements, like the temperance movement. We talked about the Black women's group before, and one that was made up mostly of white women was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it had about 150,000 members by 1890. And what they focused on was men's behavior when it came to drinking and the potential loss of wages that they were creating based on what they deemed as this immoral behavior. So they were complaining that when their husbands would be paid They would be on their way home. They would stop at the local pub and spend all of their wages on alcohol rather than bringing it home for food. And most women at this point still didn't have any legal control over their own finances, let alone their husband's finances. Frances Willard was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she was adamant that men and women needed to give up the idea that women were weak and dependent. And once they realized that women were fully capable of working and they did not need to rely on men's income, that would help to bring the wages up for women and allow them to support themselves. Within some feminist circles, there was a turn towards racism, with the suggestion that native-born U.S. white women had a higher capacity for civic engagement than did immigrants and non-white women. And this ultimately hurt their cause because they could have joined together with even more people, making a pan-woman movement, and even having non-white men on their side as supporters of the expanded vote. And I have included on the assignments page one of these videos by John Green that's on the PBS website, and it's a crash course on women's suffrage. So if you want to watch that, it's usually relatively entertaining and informative at the same time. Imperialism is typically referring to the last quarter of the 1800s, so 1875 to 1900, with Europeans as the most active colonizers until the end of the era. And what it means is seeking out land outside of the mother country, essentially. American expansionism had been evident from the beginning, with the arrival of white Europeans to North America, and the Monroe Doctrine that attempted to take Latin America under its wing, and the whole concept of manifest destiny and moving from sea to shining sea, if you will. Alaska in 1867 had been the last territory that had been acquired until the 1890s, when there was a rise in land grabbing, with the idea that trade was the main concern rather than settlement of the land itself. Intellectuals were split on the issue of expansion, with some backing it via imperialist pursuits and some arguing against it. You'll read the War Prayer by Mark Twain that is in response to the Spanish-American War, which many people saw as an attempt at imperialism. Hawaii was already tied to the United States through trade, and American planters actually overthrew the Queen in 1893 and led to the annexation of the territory in 1898. There's a PBS clip about the fall of the Hawaiian monarchy and the fall of the Hawaiian government and how it all took place. It's quite the seedy affair, and you can watch the clip that will be posted on the assignments page for you. The Spanish-American War came about following a period of revolution for the Cuban nation against Spanish rule. So 1868 saw a Cuban revolt against the Spanish, which led to a demand for independence a couple decades later in 1895, which then turned into war in 1898. And the U.S. supported Cuba at this point and shamed Spain for having used detention camps to house their political enemies on the island. The USS Maine in Havana Harbor was accidentally destroyed, and about 270 people were killed. Spain rejected the United States' request for a ceasefire, and the U.S. went to war with Cuba against Spain. The Teller Amendment was put into place to say that the U.S. had no intention of annexing the island of Cuba. So if they were going to fight with them, they had to agree not to take over afterwards. The war lasted for about 4 months, and there were less than 400 U.S. deaths, which led some people to tout it as this splendid little war. One of those was Teddy Roosevelt. He and his Rough Riders were known for making this valiant charge up San Juan Hill and for reinvigorating manhood through participation in war. So they had said that men had been becoming too soft and too like women, and they needed to become tougher and have this rugged individualism that they'd seen in the West, in this romantic notion of the West. And he was participating in that on high by going into war voluntarily and encouraging others to do the same. And as we know, eventually he became somewhat of a national hero, and he went on to be governor and vice president and eventually president of the United States. There was a huge romanticization of this war and of warfare in general. It had been a while since people had been involved in a war. It had been since the Civil War. And so there was this whole generation that was going to be missing out on that experience, and they felt that it was important and informative to be involved in something in this realm. And as we mentioned before, many people throughout the world protested this, including Mark Twain. And you'll read the War Prayer, and you'll actually be writing a short paper in response to that. And the instructions can be found on the assignments page for you, as well as the PDF of the War Prayer. The Philippine War is probably the most ignored war in U.S. history. The Korean War could also be argued as one of those, but I would say more people are aware that the Korean War happened, even if they don't know much about it. Many people aren't even aware that the Philippine War happened. President McKinley didn't think that the Philippines were ready for freedom and self-governance, but they believed that they shouldn't be under Spanish rule either. And this is where this idea of the white man's burden comes in. They saw themselves as the great emancipators to go throughout the world and free different societies. But with that came these ties that they would then be involved with that society following their freedom. And we'll see on the next slide this poem by Rudyard Kipling. And it was how many people approached fighting in wars that the U.S. really had no direct stake in, other than potential trade partners. The treaty that ended the war led to the U.S. gaining the territories of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. Cuba remained independent at this point, but the U.S. was allowed to intervene militarily when they saw fit under the Platt Amendment. And the U.S. was also allowed to use the area of Guantanamo Bay. And that's become quite a notorious place for many of us. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard of it. And we still have a detention center for those who can't be properly prosecuted within the American court system. We leave them in Guantanamo Bay, where they are essentially outside of justice and held in detention. The U.S. fought against the Filipinos when the U.S. retained the islands, and they fought for a couple years, and about 4,200 U.S. soldiers died, alongside 100,000 Filipinos. So you can see there were wildly differing casualty rates, and this was mostly based on the availability of weaponry. This was also the first land war, especially with guerrilla warfare, but the first land war that the United States had become involved in outside of the Western Hemisphere. So this is the poem of Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, and you can see this picture down here, this belief that the white people, specifically Americans, were needing to carry all the other non-white populations of the world, and that they were helpless on their own. So this is definitely a white supremacist idea, and what he says is, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go send your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait on in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wind, and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, us slowly to the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy, ungrudged praise. Comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. So it's essentially saying that white men were taking up this burden of taking care of these childish non-white nationalities and non-white ethnicities, and that they were the only ones who could save them, essentially. So it's this hero complex and this complex of American exceptionalism that you started to see. What a lot of this led to were big citizenship questions. So political democracy, race, and American citizenship were all under renewed scrutiny at this point. White supremacy contributed to all these territories not being given actual statehood rights. Puerto Rico is what's called an insular territory, which means that they are citizens of Puerto Rico, but there's not statehood. There are limited rights and voting capabilities, which balances out to taxation without representation. Hawaii became a state in 1959, so not really that long ago. It's within my mother's lifetime, for example. The Philippines won their independence in 1946, and Guam was under Navy rule until 1950 and continues to be an unincorporated territory today, which is complicated for their citizenship status and for them to receive any assistance at all, essentially. It's a very complicated system that most people are unaware even exists. You can see many short documentaries about this on the internet, and I know Vice News did a piece on it, and you could easily find this if you were looking for it, but many people don't even know to look for it. What became obvious was that there was fraternity among Anglo nations, so white nations, and racial law was enacted across the globe widely. The United States was not the only place. but it was certainly one of the great offenders here. And this idea of benevolent imperialism spread, and that people believed that they were helping a backward people update their lives. They believed that they were bringing peace and liberty to the rest of the world. Many people believed that. We know it's much more complicated than that, and continues to be. And many of these questions continue to be questions that we face over the decades. So we can understand this as a base for what we deal with at this point. And so you will respond to the Voices of Freedom questions that you will find on the assignments page, and also write your paper on the war prayer.